It was a chilly morning on September 15th, 2007. A sheep farmer named Gregorio Yaruri sat on his porch, sipping a mug of coffee and looking at the distant mountain peaks that surrounded his hometown of Carancas, a small village in southern Peru. It was silent except for the sheep bleating in the pasture. Then Gregorio heard a low sound, like a hum. At first, the noise was faint, and it sounded like it was coming from miles away. Then the hum grew louder, and the coffee in his mug started to vibrate. A moment later, pebbles on the ground surrounding his porch began to shake as the hum turned into a roar. Alarmed, Gregorio set down his mug and leaped down into the yard. He looked around, trying to figure out if the noise was human-made or maybe an earthquake. He covered his ears as the hum roared to a deafening scream. Then he spotted something small and orange streaking through the sky. An instant later, a sonic boom whipped across the valley, shattering a window in Gregorio's house. He was thrown onto his back and he rolled a few times before steadying himself in the dirt. Noises began to erupt all across the plain. Gregorio could hear dogs howling and shouts coming from some of the neighboring farms. Gregorio was bracing himself for something else to happen, but the sky above him was bright blue again. So he stood up, feeling totally shell-shocked, as he brushed the dust from his pants. He scanned the horizon for some clue as to what had caused this explosion. In the distance, he could see a plume of thick black smoke rising 100 feet into the air. At first, Gregorio was filled with dread. Then, a sense of determination swelled up inside of him. He needed to know what had just fallen from the sky. He ran for the bicycle he kept leaning up against the side of his house. He brushed the glass shards from his broken window off the seat, and then he hopped on and he set his feet on the pedals and took off towards the tower of smoke. As Gregorio neared the site of impact, the smell of rotten eggs stung the inside of his nostrils. He pulled over just long enough to grab his bandana out of his back pocket and tie it around his face to block the smell. About 100 feet from the tower of smoke, he noticed red dust covering the ground. The closer he got, the thicker the blanket of dust seemed to be. When he finally reached the base of the smoke plume, he rubbed the dust with his feet. It appeared to be clay that had been kicked up by the crash. The smoke was so thick, he still couldn't tell what had impacted the ground. But whatever it was, it had created what appeared to be a huge crater in the ground. The column of smoke was emerging from a hole about 50 feet across. It really looked like someone had just detonated a bomb there. A few minutes later, the smoke started thinning out, and Gregorio could finally see into this crater. He walked up to the edge, and his eyes widened from a combination of fear and wonder. The crater was filled with a dark green liquid. The liquid had a consistency somewhere between maybe water and sludge, and it was bubbling as if it was simmering. Gregorio pinched his nose through the bandana. The egg smell coming off of this crater was so strong that he felt sick to his stomach. He walked around the perimeter of the crater, kicking at the shards of clay and jagged rock that littered the ground. It looked like someone had smashed a huge vase to pieces. Gregorio scanned the horizon. It seemed like he was the only person who'd come to investigate this plume of smoke. He figured the neighboring farmers must be worried that whatever crashed into the ground was a bad omen. A lot of his neighbors still believed in ancient spirits. But after a while, it struck Gregorio as kind of odd that not even an emergency vehicle had come out to survey the scene. Something had just shot out of the sky and smashed into the earth. It felt like that was the kind of thing police would want to know about. But Gregorio knew help would not be coming from his village. Only about 250 people lived in Carancas, so it didn't have its own police force. The authorities were located in the nearby town of Desaguadero, which was about 7 miles up the road. Gregorio wasn't sure if the folks in Desaguadero would be able to see the smoke plume from there. If they couldn't, he worried that the authorities might not even know this happened. Gregorio jumped back on his bicycle and pedaled to the house of a neighbor who owned a motorcycle that Gregorio knew he'd be able to borrow. It was going to be up to him to raise the alarm, and he had to get out there fast. About 20 minutes later, Gregorio parked his borrowed motorcycle in front of the police station in Desaguadero and then walked inside. He was greeted by a tired-looking receptionist with the phone pressed to her ear. It seemed like she'd been talking to people for hours. 3 deputies were talking loudly about an airstrike. It took a minute for Gregorio to realize what was going on. The police did know about this explosion. One of them had seen the orange streak in the sky, but they thought that Caracas had actually been struck by a missile. Gregorio waved down one of the officers and explained he had seen a crater filled with this green ooze that smelled terrible. The officer disappeared into a back room for a moment, and then he returned with the chief of police. They asked if Gregorio could lead them to the crash site. Gregorio agreed. Soon, he was back on his neighbor's motorcycle, leading police cars along the 7-mile road back to the Caracas countryside. As the crash site came into view, Gregorio could see people moving around the rim of the crater. As he drew even closer, he realized that dozens of villagers from Caracas had come to see what had caused the smoke. He guessed that when the black plume of smoke had dissipated, the neighbors figured it was now safe to come take a look. Gregorio pulled over his motorcycle about 20 yards from the crater and dismounted. The police cars fanned out around him. As policemen approached the perimeter of the crater, Gregorio noticed his neighbors picking up rock fragments as souvenirs and pointing at the green liquid at the bottom of the massive hole. Gregorio overheard a nearby couple speculate that maybe this was the result of a missile strike from Peru's neighbor and rival, Chile. One teenage boy was talking excitedly, telling his friends they were probably just attacked by a UFO. An old woman, who Gregorio assumed was the boy's grandmother, told him to be quiet. This was clearly a sign of bad things to come, a curse sent by the spirits. She sounded terrified. Gregorio did not find any of these theories very convincing. However, he wasn't ready to offer any of his own. But the strange explosion had him just as curious as his neighbors. He picked up a shard of deep red rock near his feet and slipped it into his coat pocket, just as another car pulled onto the scene. Gregorio recognized the mayor of Caracas, Maximiliano Trujillo. Mayor Trujillo stepped out of the back seat, squinting in the sunlight. The mayor walked toward the crater, looking stunned. He stopped right next to Gregorio and asked what happened. Gregorio just shrugged, still in disbelief. Straight ahead of them, a pile of black rocks were smoking at the edge of the crater. The mayor's eyes widened when he saw them, and he began walking toward the crater to get a better look. By late afternoon, hundreds of people had gathered at the crash site. Gregorio stood near the front of the crowd, hoping that if he stuck around long enough, the police might announce what had caused this explosion. As the sun started to set, the smell of rotten eggs returned. It was faint, but pungent. Gregorio's eyes began to water. He pulled his bandana back up over his face, but that didn't work anymore. The smell was giving him a headache. A few minutes later, a short woman standing near Gregorio leaned over and began vomiting, and she wasn't the only one. People all around the crater were starting to get sick. Between the rotten smell coming off the green sludge and now the vomit, the air around the crater was now so thick that Gregorio thought he might faint. He fought his way through the crowd back to his motorcycle and sped off towards home, sucking in the fresh air as he went. When he walked through his front door, his phone was ringing. It was his son, who had moved about 6 hours away for a job after he had graduated school. As Gregorio told him about the afternoon's excitement, he took the rock out of his pocket and he laid it on the kitchen table. He began to describe its deep red color, but his son cut him off. He begged Gregorio not to touch it. If Caracas was attacked by a missile, then this red rock could very likely be radioactive. Gregorio remembered the people getting sick at the crater. He felt a surge of anxiety, and he covered the rock with a dish towel. If his son was right, half the town was now vulnerable, and Gregorio spent more time at the crater than anyone else. Panicked, he hung up on his son and ran outside to hose himself off. He didn't know how much it would help, but he had to do something. He spent the rest of the evening feeling totally anxious, until finally he managed to fall asleep. The next morning, Gregorio woke up with the sun as usual. He still felt a bit queasy, but no worse than the night before. He breathed a big sigh of relief, because he figured that radiation poisoning would have made him feel a lot sicker by now, and so probably he was in the clear. As the sunrise turned the sky a vivid pink, Gregorio walked out of his house towards the sheep pen. He grabbed tufts of hay and dried grass and scattered them on the ground, and the sheep came running over to graze. Gregorio watched until one of the sheep picked its head up and ambled away. Then he noticed something unusual. There were dark splotches on the hay right where the sheep's head had been. It took Gregorio a moment to realize what he was looking at. He walked over and grabbed the sheep that had ambled off, and he lifted its head up, and blood was trickling out of its nose. Then he looked at the ground. Another splotch of blood stained the hay beneath his feet. As he walked the length of the pen, he found drops of blood spattered all over the ground. Gregorio rushed inside and called his vet, expecting to leave a voicemail since it was still early, but to his surprise, the vet actually picked up. He sounded wide awake, like he'd already been up for hours. He said that he'd been getting calls all morning. Livestock across Caracas were getting sick. The vet promised to make Gregorio's farm his next stop. Gregorio thanked him and hung up. He had no idea what kind of sickness had emerged from that crater, but it seemed like it could be deadly. A few days after the crash, Mayor Trujillo walked between rooms at a health clinic. Every exam table had been turned into a makeshift hospital bed. More than 200 people who visited the crash site had flooded the hospital in Desaguadero. They were all sick with migraine headaches, and they were vomiting. The hospital got so overwhelmed with patients, they diverted people to smaller health clinics throughout the city, which were now acting as satellite operations. Mayor Trujillo had called the Red Cross to help administer care in these satellite clinics, but now even the clinics were completely full. The smell inside the packed clinic was terrible. People were retching and crying. To the mayor, it felt like he was walking through a war zone. Thankfully, he'd received confirmation that morning from the authorities in Lima, the capital of Peru, that Caracas had not been attacked by a missile. In fact, scientists said that the crater had been caused by a meteorite. Mayor Trujillo was relieved that they were not under attack, but a mystery remained. Nobody knew why people were now getting sick. Meteorites had never been known to have that kind of effect. Specialists were flying out from Lima to investigate further. Mayor Trujillo moved through the crowd of patients in the waiting room, trying his best to reassure them. He stopped by a Red Cross doctor who was tending to a small elderly woman on a folding chair. The mayor greeted the old woman and then thanked the doctor for traveling all this way to Desaguadero. The doctor stood upright, looking tired but hopeful. He explained that all the patients' blood work was coming back normal. He didn't know why they were sick, but judging from their symptoms, he said everyone should make a full recovery in a few days. Trujillo smiled with relief, but the old woman hissed and called the doctor a liar. Many of the patients around her nodded in agreement, eyeing the doctor like he was in on some big conspiracy. He heard them muttering about evil spirits causing this disaster. Trujillo knew that many villagers believed the meteorite was a curse from the ancient spirits, and because of that, many had refused to listen to the Red Cross doctors and aid workers. To Trujillo, this was the problem with people of the Caracas region. Outsiders never came to the area, so many of the villagers didn't trust them. Trujillo knew that Caracas was not cursed. He just needed to find a way to get his people to listen. Then an idea struck. Maybe he could get them to believe the science with the help of someone who could appease the spirits. Trujillo left the health clinic, climbed into his car, and drove the 7 miles to Caracas. The small village, nestled in the shadows of snow-capped mountains, was eerily quiet and deserted. As the mayor slowly drove through the narrow and winding streets, he could see people peering out their windows. Normally, they'd come outside to wave hello, but now it seemed like they were terrified of leaving their homes. A few minutes later, Trujillo pulled up to a small adobe house with a thatched roof. It belonged to the local shaman, a man the mayor had long respected for his wisdom. Everybody in town trusted the shaman, and Trujillo hoped he could bring some calm to the community. Trujillo stepped out of his car, and he was pleased to see that the shaman came out of his house to greet him. Trujillo explained the situation to the shaman, and the shaman nodded thoughtfully, and he agreed that the meteorite was not a curse, although it had disrupted balance in the land. And so he said he was happy to do his part to restore the natural order of things. Trujillo smiled and shook the shaman's hand. He promised he'd be in touch soon, and then Mayor Trujillo headed back to his car. With the shaman's help, he was sure he could get the townspeople to listen to him and restore order in the town. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Montreal, Canada, a professor named Peter Schultz was standing in line at a coffee shop scrolling through the news app on his phone. He taught Earth Environmental and Planetary Sciences at Brown University in Rhode Island, but he was in Montreal for a conference on craters made by meteorites and other space objects. He was fascinated by the articles about the meteorite strike in southern Peru, and not just because he found meteorites in general interesting. This one stuck out because it made no sense. The reports said that Carancas was struck by a chondrite meteorite, the most common type of meteorite, but also the most fragile. A chondrite meteorite is a type of rock that comes from asteroids. They're made up of small grains of minerals that have not been melted or changed much since they formed billions of years ago. Chondrites are so porous that they crack and burn up in Earth's atmosphere before they can hit the ground. To Peter, it seemed impossible that one of these chondrite meteorites could hit the Earth with enough force to create this massive crater. Stranger still, he had read that more than 200 people who visited the crash site had ended up in the hospital. Meteorites should not be making people sick. Peter thought there had to be more to the story than met the eye. Peter turned his phone to silent and spent the rest of the afternoon in back-to-back lectures at his conference. He finally left around dusk. As he walked to dinner, he noticed his voicemail was full of inquiries from different reporters and news outlets, hoping for a comment from him on how a meteorite could cause such a widespread sickness. But Peter had to tell these reporters the truth. He did not have answers, but he wanted to get them, and the only way to do it was to head to Peru and see the crater for himself. A few days later, Mayor Trujillo stood in the very crowded community center in Desaguadero. He had needed a huge space to hold this town hall meeting, and Carancas didn't really have a building that could accommodate this size crowd. Even this community center was packed with almost every single person from Carancas in attendance. The mayor shivered, but not because he was cold. He knew that the government scientists had discovered something that would have a profound impact on everyone in this area, and not just for those who had gotten sick at the crater. As Trujillo stood there waiting, he spotted Gregorio Yaruri sitting in the back. He was grateful to him for his role in alerting the authorities, and was happy to see that Gregorio looked healthy. In fact, most of the locals who'd gotten sick were starting to feel better. But Trujillo knew if they didn't listen to the scientists, then things could get worse again. Trujillo had invited 2 guests to this meeting. One was the local shaman, and the other was a geologist named Luisa Macedo. She was one of the scientists flown in by the government. The mayor made his way to the front of the crowd and called for silence. He had to choose his words carefully to avoid panicking those who believed that Carancas was actually cursed. He cleared his throat and announced that, yes, something had fallen from the sky, but it had been a meteorite from outer space. Before anyone could argue with him, he called the shaman over to join him and asked if he could prepare a sacrifice. It needed to be something that would appease the spirits in case they were the ones who sent the meteorite crashing to Earth. The shaman nodded. He told the crowd that they had rightfully sensed that the meteorite had unbalanced the land, but he reassured them that the correct sacrifice would help appease any unhappy spirits. He promised he would sacrifice a llama fetus at the crater as soon as possible, which should be enough to restore harmony to the area. Several of the older women present smiled, but Mayor Trujillo was still tense. Now came the hard part, getting them to accept the scientists' findings without panicking. He introduced Luisa, the government geologist. The hall erupted in whispers. Trujillo told the villagers to calm down, that Luisa was from southern Peru just like they were. That's why he'd asked her to speak. Everyone seemed to accept this, since a regional scientist seemed a little more trustworthy. The crowd settled down a bit, and then Luisa smiled and she held up a large cardboard chart she'd made showing data on the local water table. Trujillo held his breath, worried she was making things more complicated. Instead, the crowd pushed in to get a better look at what she had. Luisa explained that she and her team weren't totally sure what was making so many people and livestock sick, but they had a strong theory. The day that she and her team had arrived in town, they'd gone to the crash site and collected samples from different parts of the area. They also tested the groundwater at the bottom of the crater. Mayor Trujillo saw Luisa hesitate for a moment and then continue. She said that her team found that the water contained dangerous levels of arsenic, a deadly poison. The crowd erupted in murmurs of alarm. As Trujillo looked around the room, he wasn't surprised by everyone's reaction. When he first heard Luisa's theory, he'd been stunned too, but he needed the crowd to listen. Their lives depended on what Luisa had to say. Trujillo raised his hands and called for order, and after a few seconds, the townspeople did quiet down, and he told them to continue to listen to Luisa. Luisa nodded and then explained that when the meteorite hit Caracas, the shockwave caused the groundwater to heat up and vaporize. This caused the air to fill with a fine mist of arsenic vapor. Everyone who had gone to see the crater got sick because they had inhaled that vapor. After hearing what she had to say, the crowd became agitated again and started shouting questions. Mayor Trujillo saw Gregorio in the back, trying to be heard, and so Trujillo demanded everyone be quiet, and he pointed at Gregorio and asked him to speak. Gregorio, the sheep farmer, stood up and politely asked Luisa if that meant their drinking water was contaminated too. Luisa stayed silent for a moment. Trujillo could tell she was carefully thinking about what to say next. Finally, she nodded and said that although they did need to do more testing, it was very likely. In fact, most likely, their water supply had been contaminated for years, making the people less healthy and more vulnerable to deadly diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. And so until they knew for sure, Luisa advised the crowd to just drink bottled water. Gregorio was alarmed by what he heard, but he thanked her and sat down. Everyone else seemed totally stunned into silence by Luisa's explanation. First the meteor hit, making people sick. Now they learned their water was contaminated all along. Trujillo knew it was frightening, but at least they knew what they were dealing with. After answering more questions, Luisa wrapped up her remarks and walked off the stage. But as she headed toward him, Mayor Trujillo noticed that the scientist looked anxious. He pulled her aside and asked if everything was okay. Luisa shook her head and told him that something still didn't make sense. She was confident that the sickness had been caused by arsenic gas from the meteorite impact, but she had not actually proven that. No scientists had detected arsenic in the air around the crater. That was a theory. In fact, she didn't understand how the meteorite could have gotten hot enough to create this toxic arsenic vapor. Luisa explained that meteorites are usually freezing when they impact Earth, even though they may look like they're on fire. That's because space is extremely cold, with an average temperature of negative 454 degrees Fahrenheit. The friction caused by entering Earth's atmosphere would have heated it up a little bit, but not enough to boil water and turn it into a mist. Mayor Trujillo frowned. He now realized that even Luisa wasn't sure that her arsenic theory was right. And if she was wrong, then something else had made his people sick. Trujillo was troubled. But he had a more immediate challenge, making sure the local drinking water was safe. It was up to the scientists to figure out whether arsenic vapor or something else had caused the mass sickness. Until they figured it out, Trujillo knew he would not sleep well. A little over 2 months later, in December of 2007, Professor Peter Schultz arrived in Caracas to investigate the crash site. On a dry and sunny day, he drove through the winding roads of the rugged countryside until he reached the crater. Even though the rainy season had nearly filled it with water, he was struck by how massive it was. Peter had heard about Luisa Macedo's discovery of arsenic in the water. There was no debate that there was arsenic in the water itself, but so far, nobody had been able to explain how, or even if, arsenic got into the air. Until that was proven, there was still the possibility that some other chemical from the meteorite's impact had made everyone sick. If that was the case, the people of Carancas could still be in danger. Peter was determined to find the answer and make sure these people were safe. And over the next few weeks, he was able to slowly form a theory that connected all the dots. Usually, when chondrite meteorites shoot through the Earth's atmosphere, their fragile makeup causes them to shatter into hundreds of tiny pieces, which turn to ash long before they ever reach the Earth's surface. And that's what should have happened with this meteorite. Peter concluded that the Carancas meteorite survived its passage through the atmosphere because of its high speed and shallow entry angle. He believed that these factors, along with the heat from the Earth's atmosphere, caused the outer layers of the meteorite to melt and fuse back together. That made it dense enough to make it through the atmosphere, where it became superheated and unleashed the arsenic vapor once it hit the ground. All this meant that the people of Carancas were safe. It was the meteorite and not some other unidentified danger that heated up the arsenic-laced water and turned it into vapor. Thankfully, the damage caused by the meteorite's impact was not permanent. All the people who'd gotten sick, including Gregorio Yaruri, made a full recovery, and so did all the animals. Thanks to the research of Luisa Macedo and the other scientists, arsenic was detected in the drinking water, and nonprofit organizations have installed measures to make it safer. Even though the water is cleaner and the arsenic gas is long gone, the people of Carancas will always remember when, in a way, they were attacked by a UFO.
On January 16, 1984, 43-year-old Kay Swartz sat down to dinner with her 51-year-old husband Bob and their kids, Larry and Annie. The kitchen of their split-level home had a window that looked out into the backyard, and they could all see snow falling outside. The Swartz's neighborhood in Cape St. Clair, Maryland, a suburb of Annapolis, was quiet and secluded, but the snow made it feel even quieter and further away from the rest of the world than usual. And Bob worried that if the weather got any worse, he might have trouble driving into work the following day. But then he heard Kay starting to pray, so he looked away from the window and bowed his head. Kay finished her short prayer, and then the rest of the family said amen, and then they all started eating. Dinner time with the family was always Kay's favorite part of the day. Ever since she was young, she dreamed of having a close-knit family that sat down together every night to share a meal and talk about how their days had gone. And now, Kay's dream had come true. She watched as her 17-year-old son Larry and her 9-year-old daughter Annie dug into their dinner, and she looked over at Bob and smiled. Bob took a drink and then smiled back. Dinner with the family was his favorite time too, because just like Kay, he'd always wanted to have a house full of kids. In fact, it was Kay and Bob's shared love of family that had first drawn them to each other when they met in graduate school at the University of Maryland 16 years earlier. At least that's what they told all of their friends. The truth was, the first thing that had drawn Bob to Kay was her looks. The first time he saw her in one of the campus parking lots, he couldn't stop staring. Kay was 5 foot 10 inches tall with long legs and a long neck. Her brown hair was cropped short, and she had a perfect smile. Bob thought she looked like a model. And Bob, generally speaking, did not have the confidence to talk to women who looked like models. He was short and stocky, and he'd lost most of his hair in his early 20s, which had always made him a little insecure. But once he'd seen Kay, he couldn't stop thinking about her. So when he saw her again eating lunch in the university cafeteria, he took a deep breath, walked right up to her, and started a conversation. And Bob would always be happy that he'd taken that risk, because he and Kay had hit it off immediately and discovered they had a lot in common. They were both devoutly religious, they believed education was the key to success, and they put their love of family above all else. And so, soon after that first meeting, they were spending as much time together as they could. And within a few months, they were already planning their future together. But not long after they'd gotten married, Kay learned that she was not capable of having children of her own. This made her feel like a failure, like she was letting Bob down, and that their dream of having a big, happy family would now never come true. But after Kay and Bob spent time talking and praying together, they started to look at this seemingly bad news as a sort of gift. They decided that if they couldn't have kids of their own, they would adopt and provide a loving home for children who had never been fortunate enough to have families of their own. So, in 1973, they adopted Larry when he was 6 years old. And when Larry arrived, he felt like he was the luckiest kid in the world. He had spent his childhood in and out of foster care and never felt like he had parents, but now Kay and Bob had taken him in, and he was sure he had found his forever home. And Larry was everything Kay and Bob could have hoped for in a son. He was sweet, polite, fun to be around, and he even enjoyed going to church with his parents. Larry's adoption was such a success that pretty much right away, Kay and Bob began talking about adopting more children. And 6 years after Larry joined the family, Kay and Bob adopted Annie from South Korea when she was 4 years old. Annie, like Larry, was just incredible to be around from the moment she arrived at their home. Her smile was infectious, and she was smart, curious, and always happy. Bob and Kay adored Annie, and Larry made it his mission to be the best big brother he could possibly be to his new sister. So, back in the present, in 1984, while Kay ate her dinner with her family that night, she was very happy with how her life as a mother had gone so far. But, deep down, she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss, because there was one empty chair at the dinner table where Kay and Bob's third adopted child used to sit. Less than 2 years after Kay and Bob had adopted Larry, and about 4 years before they adopted Annie, they adopted another boy named Michael. At the time, Michael was 8 years old, about 6 months older than Larry, and Kay and Bob hoped the two boys would become fast friends and soon grow into devoted brothers. But Michael struggled to adapt to his new life. His birth parents had abandoned him when he was an infant, and by the time he was adopted by Kay and Bob, he'd already lived in 6 different foster homes and developed a serious distrust of authority figures. And as a result, Michael clashed with his adoptive father, Bob, right away, mainly because Bob could be strict, especially when it came to school. And when Michael struggled in school, Bob would yell at him and ground him, and this would cause Michael to act out. And while Kay wasn't as strict as Bob, she was still a high school teacher, and she took education very seriously. So she couldn't understand why Michael didn't even seem to care about his grades. But when she tried to talk to him about it, he would get frustrated with her, and before long, they'd be shouting at each other. From the beginning, things between Michael and his new parents just didn't seem to be working out. And when Annie joined the family in late 1978, the Michael situation got much worse. Michael accused Bob and Kay of loving Annie more than they loved him, and Michael just seemed to go out of his way to start arguments with his parents, which made life very challenging for everyone in that house, especially Larry, because all Larry wanted was for everyone to be happy and to get along. And so, when Michael fought with Kay and Bob, Larry would try to talk Michael down and keep the peace. But Larry, who was sweet and soft-spoken, rarely had any luck calming Michael down, or getting his parents to go easier on Michael. It was like both sides were unwilling to compromise on any issue. As Michael got older, the arguments between him and his parents became more frequent and more heated. And when Michael became a teenager, he started getting in trouble at school for fighting, and when he got home from school, he would yell and scream at his parents almost every day. Around this time, Kay and Bob started to feel like they had totally lost control of their second son. Then, on a night in 1980, when Michael was 14 years old, the tension between he and his parents reached a breaking point. That night, Michael had asked Kay and Bob if he could go hang out with some of his friends, but they had told him no, that he needed to stay home and do his schoolwork. Michael was furious, and after screaming at his parents, he just snuck out of the house and met up with his friends. But when he got home later that night, Kay and Bob were waiting for him by the front door, and they told him that they had had enough of his bad behavior and that he was not allowed to come back inside. And they didn't just mean for that night. They meant forever. They were disowning him. The following day, Kay and Bob contacted social services, and Michael was taken away and sent to a reform school, which is an institution where youth offenders are sent as an alternative to prison. Kay felt absolutely terrible about this decision, but with Michael now gone, at least Larry and Annie would hopefully have a happier, healthier, and less disruptive home. Now sitting at the kitchen table, staring at Michael's empty seat, Kay tried to remind herself that that decision she and her husband had made a few years earlier had been the only decision they could have made. After all, they had recently learned from social services that Michael, who was now 17, had had to be moved from the reform school to a mental institution because of his erratic behavior. And so, at least to Kay and Bob, this only seemed to prove that Michael would not have worked out long-term in their family. But deep down, whenever Kay thought about Michael, she couldn't help but feel like a failure. That night, after dinner, Bob got up from the table and headed to his home office that he'd set up in a small room located in the basement. Bob had gotten in on the ground floor of the growing computer industry, and he enjoyed the work and the money it brought in for him and his family. But the job sometimes required him to do work from home late into the night. And Kay knew that once Bob disappeared into his basement office, there was a good chance the rest of the family would not see him until the following morning. So Kay cleared the kitchen table with Larry's help, and then she and Annie headed upstairs. As Kay helped Annie get ready for bed, Larry came into Annie's bedroom and said goodnight to her before he walked back into the hall and headed for his own room. Kay gave Annie a kiss, said goodnight, and headed out into the hall just a moment after Larry had. Annie heard the sound of her brother's bedroom door shutting, and she heard her mother walking down the stairs. And soon after that, Annie's eyes got heavy and she fell asleep. But then, a couple of hours later, at around 11:30 p.m., Annie suddenly woke up because she heard what she thought were the sound of voices in the hall right outside her room. So Annie rubbed her eyes, climbed out of bed, and stumbled to her door, still half asleep. But when she opened her door, she realized the voices were not coming from the hallway, they were coming from downstairs. And the voices she heard were not people talking, but rather people screaming. Annie took a step into the hall, and instantly the screaming stopped. But Annie was still very worried and wanted to know what was going on, so she slowly walked downstairs, but when she got down there, the first floor was quiet and deserted. And as she stood there looking around in the dark, she suddenly thought she heard something outside the house. So she walked through the living room to a sliding glass door that looked out into the backyard where she heard the sound, and the moonlight, it was bouncing off the snow and created just enough light for Annie to get a good look at the backyard. And what she saw out there terrified her. In fact, Annie, after seeing it, she would turn and run back upstairs, dive into her bed, and pull the covers up over her head. And as she lay there, she told herself that this could not be real, that this had to be a bad dream. The following morning, Annie woke up and the house felt cold and quiet. She thought about what she'd seen the night before, but she was sure now that it really must have just been a nightmare, because if it hadn't been, if it had been real, wouldn't her brother or parents have come and got her and told her what was going on? Feeling somewhat reassured by this thought, Annie got out of bed and walked into the hall. She called out for her parents, but no one answered, so Annie walked downstairs to see where people were. But when she didn't see or hear anyone on the first floor, she started to get scared. So Annie ran back up the stairs to Larry's room, she opened the door, and she found him asleep in his bed. She shook him awake, and when he rolled over, she told him that she couldn't find their parents. Larry could tell that Annie was definitely scared, and so immediately became the big brother and tried to calm her down by telling her everything was okay and that their parents likely had just gone outside for a minute and they'd be back soon. Then he climbed out of his bed, took his little sister's hand, and together they walked downstairs. But when they got downstairs, Larry happened to look out the kitchen window into the backyard, and when he did, he stopped moving. He pressed his face against the glass and squinted to get a clear view of the yard, and when he did, his eyes went wide, and he instinctively reached over and covered Annie's eyes with his hand so she couldn't see what he was seeing. Then he picked his sister up and he ran to the phone to call 911. And as he ran, neither he nor Annie seemed to notice the red drops all over everything. A 31-year-old detective from the Anne of Arundel County Police, named Gary Barr, arrived at the neat little home in the quiet suburban neighborhood, and right away, the officers who'd already responded to Larry's frantic 911 call led the detective into the family's backyard. And when Detective Barr got out there and saw the scene, he just stopped and stared. Like Larry, the detective had a hard time processing what was in front of him. Detective Barr was a former Marine, and he'd seen some gruesome things during his time in the military, but he'd never seen anything like this. The ground in front of him, about 10 feet away from the sliding glass door at the back of the house, was covered in a dark red slush from where massive amounts of blood had mixed with the snow overnight. And just beyond the bloody slush, a few feet ahead of him, he saw a dead body partially covered in fresh snow. The detective took a deep breath of cold air, then slowly circled around the blood-soaked part of the yard and approached the body. The body belonged to Kay Swartz. She was lying face down in the snow, her neck was covered in blood, and she was completely naked except for having a sock on one of her feet. Barr directed a few members of his team to remain in the backyard to take photos of Kay's body and to further investigate the area. Then he walked through the backyard to the open sliding glass door that led into the house. And on that glass door, Detective Barr saw part of a bloody palm print that the officers who'd first arrived on the scene had discovered as well. Barr knew the print was a significant clue, but at the time, in order to learn anything from the print, the police would have to send samples to the FBI forensics lab in Washington, D.C., because the FBI had the technology to run the appropriate tests. Detective Barr spoke with other officers nearby to confirm that the samples would be sent off quickly to D.C., but Barr knew even if they got sent today, it would be weeks before they would hear anything from the FBI. And so Barr was not willing to pin the hopes of the entire investigation on this palm print that could even turn out to belong to the victim and not the killer. And so Detective Barr stepped through the door into the house to begin looking for more clues, but once again, as soon as he was inside, he had to just stop and stare at what was in front of him. There were pools and streaks of dried blood on the floor leading from the back door where he was to the living room. And when Barr stepped into the living room, he saw blood spatter all over the walls. He still had no idea what had happened, but he knew whoever had done this had been filled with rage during the attack. And the blood didn't stop in the living room. Barr found more splatter on the steps nearby that led down into the basement. So Barr followed that path of blood and eventually wound up in the small room in the basement, Bob's office. And once inside, he saw blood everywhere, and in the corner on the floor was Bob. He was deceased and had obvious cuts on his hands, chest, and neck. As members of the investigation team photographed and searched Bob's office, Detective Barr wandered back through the house and then walked out the front door. He hoped the cold air outside would help clear his head. He was in shock at what he'd seen inside the house, because things like this just didn't happen in safe, quiet neighborhoods in Cape St. Clair. Barr stood there just breathing in the fresh air for a minute, and then he walked across the street towards one of the Swartz's neighbors' houses. When Barr had arrived at the crime scene, he'd told one of his officers to take Larry and Annie to this neighbor's house and to wait for him there. And so when Barr walked inside that neighbor's house, the officer was there with the two kids. Larry was wearing a pajama shirt, jeans, and high-top sneakers, and Annie was in a long nightshirt. As Barr approached the children, he saw Larry holding Annie's hand, gently consoling her. Larry was a relatively small and skinny kid, but it was clear to Barr that Larry was trying to act big and strong for his sister's sake. Barr walked up to the kids, and he first turned to Larry, and in a calm voice, he asked the child if he had noticed anything unusual the night before. Larry apologized and said he couldn't be much help. He told the detective that he'd gone to his room not long after dinner, looked at some notes from his Spanish class, and then went to bed. He didn't hear or see anything until the following morning when he and his sister had gone downstairs together to look for their parents, and that's when Larry had looked out the window and seen his mother in the snow and dialed 911. Then, without Barr asking, Annie suddenly lifted up her head and said that she had seen something the night before. Barr immediately crouched down to get to Annie's eye level and then asked her what she had seen. Annie told him that she'd woken up in the middle of the night because she thought people were talking outside of her room. But then, when she went into the hall, she heard screaming coming from downstairs. When the screaming suddenly stopped, she went downstairs to see what was going on, but when she got there, it was all quiet. Then she told the detective that she thought she had heard something outside, so she whipped around and looked out the door that opened into the backyard, and that was when she saw the terrifying thing that sent her running back up to her room and under her covers. Annie said she'd seen a very tall man with dark curly hair slowly walking away from their house. As she said this, Barr noticed Larry's eyes go wide, and then the boy started shaking his head. When Barr asked him what was wrong, Larry told him that the man Annie said she'd seen outside fit the description of their estranged brother, Michael, who was 6 foot 4 inches tall and had dark curly hair. Detective Barr didn't know what to say. These poor kids who had finally found a safe and loving home with their adoptive parents had just lost that family and their new lives in a single day. Barr smiled at Annie and Larry and thanked them for their help. Then, leaving them there with the neighbors and the other officer who had brought them there, Detective Barr walked back outside and headed back across the street to the Swartz's house. As he walked, he knew one of his next moves would be to investigate his new primary suspect, Michael. Other than the bloody palm print, police had very little physical evidence from the scene of the crime. So, Barr and the other investigators began to question the Swartz's friends, families, and other associates to learn everything they could about the family. And through those conversations, Barr would learn that not long before Michael had left the house for good 4 years earlier, his outbursts with Bob had gone from just screaming fights to physical fights. And some of the neighbors were willing to admit that they thought Bob had most likely hit Michael on several occasions. And Barr also learned from a family friend that Michael had threatened to kill Kay and Bob, and that he had allegedly said that all he'd have to do was grab a knife and stab them. Barr knew that the threat of murder made Michael, who was already the prime suspect, look even more guilty, but Barr quickly discovered a major problem with the theory that Michael was the killer. Because Michael, who resided in a state mental hospital for psychiatric evaluation, had apparently been at the hospital on the night of the murders, at least according to hospital records. But Barr wasn't willing to take those records at face value. He wanted to meet with Michael in person because Michael simply had too many red flags to ignore. And so, days after the murder, Detective Barr drove out to pay Michael a visit at the mental hospital, which was a little over 10 miles away from the Swartz's house. When Barr arrived, a staff member from the hospital led him through the building, and Barr was horrified by the conditions he found. Screams from patients echoed from a large open room packed with beds. The floors and walls looked like they hadn't been cleaned in months, and Barr couldn't tell who, if anyone, was in charge of the place. He was also taken aback by how little security there seemed to be in the hospital. In fact, by the time he stepped into the room where he was supposed to meet Michael, he was convinced Michael could have easily slipped out of the hospital, made the relatively short trip to the Swartz's house, carried out the murders, and made it back to the hospital without anyone on staff ever noticing. Barr took a seat in a metal chair across a metal table from Michael. The room they were in was cramped, and the fluorescent light overhead cast a sickly glow on the dirty white walls. But Barr didn't notice any of that, because from the moment he sat down, he was fixated on Michael's neck. There were several red marks on one side of Michael's long, muscular neck, and so Barr asked Michael if he had gotten those marks in a fight. But Michael just grinned and told the detective the marks were actually hickeys that he'd gotten while making out with a girl he knew. Barr smiled back and then proceeded to tell Michael about what happened to his former adoptive parents. And Michael didn't seem remotely fazed by this horrible news. He just sat there, calm as can be. But Detective Barr was experienced enough to know that Michael's reaction to what he was told was not necessarily proof of guilt or innocence. And so Barr began asking basic questions, starting with, where was Michael on the night Bob and Kay were killed, January 16th? And Michael's answer, which was delivered just as calmly as his reaction to the news about his former parents, was simple. He'd been right here in the hospital where the state of Maryland had put him. But Barr wasn't convinced Michael was being honest, so he leaned across the table, looked Michael right in the eyes, and pushed him to talk about his troubled relationship with his adoptive parents and the threats of violence he'd made against them in the past. Barr had hoped this approach might kind of rattle Michael and maybe get him to accidentally give something away, but this didn't happen. Michael stayed calm and stuck to his story. He had been at the hospital when they were killed, period. By the time Barr left the hospital, he was very frustrated. Between the hospital's obviously lax security and Michael's bizarre, nonchalant reaction and answers that he gave, it just seemed like Michael had to be lying, that he really had to be the killer. But without physical evidence from the crime scene or any kind of confession from Michael, Barr knew he was going to have to keep working to prove this theory. And not long after this initial meeting with Michael, Detective Barr's job got even harder. Because right after Barr left the mental hospital, Michael contacted a defense attorney who advised him not to speak with anyone from law enforcement about the murders of Kay and Bob Swartz. And so, a couple of days later, when Barr tried to set up another meeting with Michael at the hospital, he was refused. Now, Barr felt like he was running out of options, because in addition to not being able to speak to his primary suspect, he was still waiting to hear back from the FBI with the results of the tests they'd run on the bloody palm print. So, feeling like he was at a dead end, Barr went back to the drawing board and tried to find any other leads that might help him discover exactly what had happened to Kay and Bob. While investigators had been questioning people who were close to Kay and Bob, they discovered that, like Barr, most of these people thought Michael was probably the killer. But there was one person who investigators spoke to that offered a tip that sent Barr's investigation in an entirely new direction. A friend of the family informed Barr that Bob had been a staunch anti-abortion activist and that he had spent significant amounts of time publicly protesting an abortion clinic in the area. And it turned out that Bob's protests had often turned aggressive, and he'd possibly made some enemies in the process. So, Detective Barr did his job and tracked down people who worked at the clinic and some of Bob's fellow protesters. But as the days went by, he felt like this was all just a big distraction, and he didn't think this line of questioning was getting him any closer to solving the case. Because Detective Barr was sure that Michael must have at least been involved in the murders. So, Barr abandoned the abortion clinic theory and decided to just basically wait for the FBI to send back the test results from the bloody print that had been found on the sliding glass door at the murder scene. And finally, in March of 1984, almost 2 months after Bob and Kay were murdered, the results arrived. And as Detective Barr expected, these test results would break the case wide open. However, the results would lead Detective Barr down a path he had not even considered during his initial investigation. Based on the test results from the FBI, evidence found at the scene of the crime, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe took place at the Swartz home on the night Kay and Bob died, January 16, 1984. At around 11:30 p.m. on January 16th, snow was on the ground outside the Swartz home and the temperature was well below freezing. But sweat dripped down the killer's forehead as they walked through the Swartz house towards the living room. The killer felt lightheaded, and they could still feel the slight burn in their stomach from the shots of rum they'd drunk only a few minutes earlier. The killer stopped a few feet from the living room, hidden in the shadows, and listened to the sound of the television. Then they poked their head around the corner and saw, in the glow of the TV, there was a woman wearing blue flannel pajamas, Kay, sitting in a black vinyl chair, watching the TV. In front of her was a small table with the remains of what looked like her late-night snack, an empty plate, a fork, and a sharp steak knife. The killer was not actually carrying a weapon. In reality, they had not fully mapped out how this attack would go, but the steak knife on Kay's table seemed like the perfect solution. So the killer took a few steps into the living room, but then suddenly stopped. And as they looked at Kay sitting there peacefully watching TV, they started to have second thoughts about what they were about to do. But then the killer took a long, deep breath and told themselves this was the right move. And then they continued to walk through the living room towards Kay. The killer's footsteps caused the wooden floors to creak as they moved. Kay heard those creaks and quickly looked up from the TV to see who was there. And when she saw, she was startled, but mostly she was angry, and she yelled something at the killer. And the killer shouted something right back. And then before Kay could possibly understand what was happening, the killer rushed forward, grabbed Kay's steak knife, and slashed the side of Kay's neck. Kay screamed, and the killer just froze, like they were stunned by what they'd just done. In that moment of hesitation, Kay put a hand to her neck to try to stop the bleeding, pulling herself out of her chair, and then she tried to run out of the room. But the killer, filled with rage, rushed after Kay and managed to slash her neck 6 more times. The killer watched her fall to the floor, Kay struggled to pull herself up onto her hands and knees, but she was now bleeding profusely and her breath was quiet and shallow. The killer stood over her, raised the knife again, and was about to bring it back down for one final blow when suddenly they heard a sound coming from the steps that led to the basement. The killer stopped what they were doing and rushed over to the top of the steps and looked down to see what the noise was, and what the killer saw at the foot of the stairs was Bob standing in the doorway of his basement office. And when Bob saw the killer standing there with the steak knife in hand, he screamed for help, but there was no help coming, and Bob had nowhere to go. He was trapped in the basement. Without hesitation, the killer walked down the stairs and tried to slash at Bob's face. But Bob, who was trying to back up, managed to throw his hands up to protect himself, and so the knife only cut into his hands. Bob managed to stumble back into his office, but the killer pursued, lunging at him again once inside and stabbing wildly at his neck. The strikes started to land, and before long Bob had fallen to the ground, at which point the killer stabbed him several more times in the chest before finally stopping and standing up. In total, Bob was stabbed 17 times, including blows that severed his left and right carotid arteries in his neck, which supply blood to the brain. Bob lay motionless on the floor of his office, with blood pooling all around him as he died. The killer stood there for a minute in a daze, gasping for breath and staring down at Bob's now dead body. But then the killer snapped out of it and remembered Kay might still be alive upstairs. So the killer ran out of Bob's office, back upstairs into the living room, and saw Kay was now gone. But the killer saw a path of blood on the floor that led out of the living room to the open sliding glass door that led to the backyard. Following the path of blood, the killer ran to the back of the house where they slammed their hand on that glass door, which is how the bloody print was left, and then the killer stepped outside. The killer could see their own breath in the cold night air, and they could feel the snow crunch under their shoes, but the adrenaline made their face and hands feel flushed and hot. Then, in the moonlight, the killer saw Kay slowly staggering through the yard, desperately trying to get away. Blood dripped from her neck and left dark red pools behind her in the snow. Kay tried to scream for help, but the cuts from the killer's knife had damaged her neck and throat, and so she couldn't make enough sound to be heard. As the killer watched Kay moving through the yard, the urge to cause her as much pain as possible suddenly took over. The killer looked around the yard and spotted a wood-splitting maul, which is like a sledgehammer with a sharp axe head, leaning against a pile of firewood. Then the killer slipped the knife into their jeans pocket, walked over and grabbed the maul with both hands, and then ran over to Kay. When the killer reached her, she was barely able to stand. The killer raised the wood-splitting maul and slammed it into the back of Kay's head. Her skull cracked, and then she crumpled to the ground. Even though Kay was now dead, the killer was not done with her. They wanted to humiliate her. So the killer stripped Kay naked except for one sock. But after the killer tossed Kay's pajamas to the ground, they suddenly started to panic. It was like, for the first time, they realized what they had just done. The killer's hands were shaking, and they saw that their clothes were covered in blood, but they knew they had to get rid of the weapons, so they walked through the yard away from the house, they wiped down the handles of the maul and the knife with a clean part of their shirt, and then threw them into the woods that surrounded the Swartz's backyard. Then the killer walked back through the yard past Kay's body and went inside the Swartz's house. Once inside, the killer walked through the house to the laundry room where they stripped off their clothes, piled them into the washing machine, and then hit start. At this point, the killer's head was pounding, their arms and back ached, and they felt exhausted, so they walked upstairs, headed down the hall past Annie's room, and glanced at the door that led to Michael's old room. Then the killer stepped past that door to his own door that led to his bedroom, and he climbed into his own bed and went to sleep. Larry Swartz, who everybody thought was the quiet, sweet, perfect son, was in fact the killer. The results of the FBI tests made it clear that the bloody palm print on the sliding glass door belonged to Larry and not to Michael, like so many people had thought. And when Detective Barr learned the palm print was Larry's, he thought back to the beginning of his investigation when he first spoke to Larry and Annie right after he had arrived at the crime scene. and he would come to understand that little Annie thought of her 5'9" brother, Larry, as being a, quote, very tall person, because pretty much everyone who was over 5'5" seemed very tall to her. But Larry, thinking on his feet, had immediately used her description of the very tall man in the backyard, the likely killer, to his advantage, pointing out that his former brother, Michael, was in fact very tall, 6'4" to be exact, which is considered very tall by basically all adults. Michael did this, of course, to deflect suspicion away from himself. Police arrested Larry, and while in custody, he would confess to killing his parents. Larry claimed he had killed Kay in the house and had not chased her down and killed her in the yard like the police said. But Larry's memory of the night was fuzzy, and Detective Barr didn't think Larry's version of events fit with the evidence found in the backyard and in the house. But Barr did take Larry at his word when Larry explained why he had killed his parents. Larry said that once Michael had been kicked out of the house, he, Larry, became the target of Kay and Bob's very strict disciplinary tactics. They would yell at Larry constantly about his bad grades, ground him for weeks at a time, and keep him from going out on dates with the girl he liked. Larry grew very angry at his parents, and he felt like they enjoyed humiliating him. And then, on January 16, 1984, Larry snapped. That night, after Annie had gone to bed, he and Kay got into a shouting match when he told her he had failed his Spanish exam. And Kay said that knowing Larry, he would probably fail all of his other exams too. So Larry stormed upstairs to his bedroom, slammed his door, reached under his bed, and grabbed a soda bottle that was actually filled with rum. And as he drank the rum, he got angrier at his parents, and he convinced himself that they were going to kick him out of the house like they'd done to Michael, and he'd never get to see his little sister Annie again. So Larry decided the only solution was to kill Kay and Bob. So he went downstairs and did just that. Larry ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but after serving 9 years, he was granted parole. Larry would move to Florida, where he would die from a heart attack in 2004 at the age of 38.
On the night of October 17, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take her dog for a walk and have a smoke. It was very late. It was about 1:30 in the morning. Now, this cabin where she was staying was very isolated. It was about a half-mile away from any neighbors, but Ada actually enjoyed the solitude. She was surrounded on all sides by forest and swamps, and the wilderness actually made Ada feel a lot safer than when she was back home in the densely populated Detroit area where she lived full-time. And this was because, just a few months earlier when she had been back home in Detroit, she had been the victim of an unprovoked attack. She had been out in the city around all these people in broad daylight, and this guy came up to her and just jumped her, broke her nose, gave her a concussion, and then ran off. But the scariest part of this attack was not the fact that she had been brutalized. It was that this guy did not appear to have any reason to attack her. He didn't know Ada, and Ada had not been robbed or anything. It was like he just randomly identified her and attacked her. And the guy had never been caught. And so this ordeal had had such a profound impact on Ada that it really began to affect her health, both mentally and physically. She started to just kind of decline. And on top of that, she had been laid off from her engineering job, and so now she was unemployed and seriously depressed. And so recently, when Ada's uncle had called her and offered to pay her to come out and live in this 2-story family cabin and fix it up for the winter, Ada had jumped at the chance. I mean, not only would this solve her unemployment issue, but also she loved this cabin. It had been in her family for 75 years, and some of her fondest childhood memories were in this cabin. And so she looked at this as a chance to kind of get away from the city and just be in her happy place and kind of reset and recover from the trauma of the attack. And so for the past week, Ada and her boyfriend had been staying in this cabin and doing small repairs and cleaning it up. But 2 days earlier, her boyfriend had had to leave and go back to the city where they were actually fixing up another property, a condo, and so now it was just Ada and her dog. But that was totally fine with Ada. She liked being out here by herself, so this was no big deal. But tonight, she was feeling frustrated because she couldn't sleep.
About an hour earlier, she had taken a pill to help her sleep, but so far it hadn't worked, and so she was feeling kind of wired and anxious, and so she had decided to go on a walk with her dog in hopes that that would clear her mind and allow her to finally get some rest. Now, these roads that surrounded this cabin were kind of small and zigzaggy, and there weren't any street lights. I mean, this is not exactly a good place to go for a nighttime walk. But Ada knew this place like the back of her hand, and she also carried a 9mm pistol in her pocket, just for protection. And so after walking for a few minutes down one of these dark, winding roads, Ada's dog stopped to relieve himself on a bush. So as the dog was going to the bathroom, Ada just casually smoked and waited. But at some point, the dog just stopped going to the bathroom, turned slightly, and began growling, and its ears perked up, and it was looking off into the darkness right ahead of them. And so Ada instinctively took her flashlight and raised it up and aimed it in the direction her dog was looking. And right away, the cone of light illuminated these two eyes looking right back at Ada. And immediately Ada knew what she was staring at. It was a mountain lion. And so doing her best to stay calm, Ada slowly reached into her pocket to pull out her gun, but before pulling it out, the two eyes blinked shut, and then she heard it kind of turn and run off into the forest. It was gone. Once Ada was sure the mountain lion really was gone, she breathed a sigh of relief and then very quickly tugged on her dog's leash. They turned around and she hustled back towards the cabin. When Ada reached her cabin, which was all lit up because she had left all the lights on before she had left, she jumped up the front steps, she opened up the door, she went inside with her dog, and after letting her dog off the leash, she shut and locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and texted her boyfriend to tell him about this mountain lion. And then after hitting send, Ada felt relieved to be back in her cabin, but at the same time, she still felt very on edge. I mean, she had been, just a few feet away from a mountain lion in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. But as Ada was doing her best to calm herself down, she heard this noise coming from outside the living room window, almost like twig snapping, like somebody was walking past the window. And so the way this cabin was set up is when you first walked inside, you were in the kitchen, and then the back half of the cabin was a living room, and then there were also stairs leading up to a second floor. But from in the kitchen, you had a clear line of sight into the living room and vice versa. It was kind of like one big room with two functions. And so from where Ada was standing in the kitchen, she could clearly see the window in the living room where this noise had kind of come through. But because the inside of the cabin was all lit up and the outside was dark, from her perspective, all she could see was a reflection on that window. So to look outside that window to see what had made that noise, she would need to get right up next to the window. And so feeling pretty nervous at this point, she walked across the cabin, she made her way towards this window, and then she pressed her face right up against the glass to look outside. But all she saw outside was just darkness. I mean, there was nothing out there. And so Ada stepped back from the window and started to wonder if maybe the sound she had just heard was maybe that mountain lion. Maybe it followed her back here. That was terrifying, but at least she was inside. But also she was thinking to herself, mountain lions are not known for being aggressive towards humans, and they wouldn't come up to her cabin like this and prowl around outside. That's just not what mountain lions do. But Ada didn't really have any other explanation, and so she told herself, it's gotta be nothing, there's nothing out there, this is a safe place. And so she kind of forgot about the noise, and she took off her coat and put her stuff down, and then she sat down on the couch in the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But only about 20 minutes later, when Ada had finally relaxed and was even thinking about getting into her bed and going to sleep, she heard another noise coming from that same window in the living room. And this time, when she looked up and looked out that window, despite the reflections inside the cabin, she could clearly tell there was something moving outside of her cabin. And it was definitely not a mountain lion. It looked like a man. And so Ada had to stifle a scream, and then instinctively she lunged for her gun on the coffee table and then darted behind the couch and crouched down to make sure whoever was out there couldn't see her. And then, with gun in hand, she began calling out to the person out there that, hey, I'm armed. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot you. But it was just silence. And then Ada strained her ears to try to hear any sound that would give away where this person went. Were they still outside that window? Had they moved somewhere else? But all she could hear was the sound of the wind whipping outside and an owl hooting off in the distance. But then, right as Ada was starting to wonder, did I really see somebody out there? Is this all in my head? That's when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps on her front porch. And so again, Ada had to stifle a scream and she darted to the other side of the couch, preventing the person from the front of the house to seeing her now. Then she grabbed her phone and she was dialing 911 and she was about to hit call when she stopped herself. And she began to wonder, am I just totally overreacting here? I don't know if there's somebody out there. I could be hearing things. Or maybe it's just like an animal or something. And also, deep down, Ada knew that ever since that attack in Detroit that summer, that basically everything scared her. And she was starting to wonder if maybe she was just being totally paranoid and there was nothing going on. And she didn't want to embarrass herself by calling 911 and having them come out here and finding nothing. And so Ada decided she would call her boyfriend, and so she called her boyfriend, and as the phone is ringing, she's listening intently for any other footsteps outside, but she can't hear anything. And then her boyfriend, he didn't pick up. It's also like 2:30 in the morning at this point, but her boyfriend doesn't answer. And so after that, she tries calling one of her friends, and her friend does pick up. And right away, Ada just began telling this friend about all the things that had happened that night, from going out and seeing the mountain lion and then coming back in, hearing the sound and now hearing the footsteps on the front porch. And, she was worried that maybe she was just making it all up, but she was still really scared. And even though Ada was trying to be composed as she was telling her friend, her voice began to crack and she began to cry because she really was scared. And the friend just said, "Look, I'm going to call the police on your behalf. It seems like it's worth having them come out just to make sure you're really okay. Give me the address and I'll tell them where to go." And so Ada would give her friend the address, but she told the friend, "Thank you, but do not call right now. Just please stay on the phone for a minute and let me just do a quick investigation. Let me look out the windows, and just really make sure that this is nothing before you call the police." And so the friend said, "Okay, look around, but then I'm calling the police." And so with her phone and her gun in hand, Ada very carefully crept out from behind the couch, keeping a low profile, staying below the sight line of all the windows. And she crept from the living room into the kitchen towards the front of the house, and she walked over to the sink, and she very slowly raised her head until she could just barely peek through the window right above the sink that overlooked the front porch. Because remember, that was the last place she had heard sounds, from the front porch. And so she very carefully peeks and looks out the window, and there's nothing there. Nobody's on the porch. It's just empty, dark forest. She's safe. Ada let out a relieved half cry, half laugh, and then stood all the way up and felt totally ridiculous because clearly she had just imagined, all these people wandering around the outside of her house. And so she was about to tell her friend that, "Hey, sorry, there is no issue here, don't call the police." But before she could get the words out, Ada happened to turn around and was looking back towards the living room, and she froze. Because there, in that same window she had heard those sounds coming from in the living room, was now the silhouettes of two men, clear as day, just looking in the window right at Ada. And so acting purely on instinct, Ada just raised her gun and aimed it at these two men, and to her horror, the two men also raised guns and aimed them right back at Ada. And so Ada just started firing her gun at the window, and these men began shooting back at her, and right before Ada leapt to the ground, she was pretty sure she hit one of the men in the head with one of her rounds, and so she lands on the ground. It's absolute pandemonium at this point. Then her friend, who's still on the phone, is screaming like, "What's going on? What's going on?" And all Ada could think to do was yell out, "There's two men, they're shooting at me, I think I shot one of them." And the friend is screaming, "I'm gonna call the police." And then the line goes dead. And Ada, who's crouched down behind the kitchen island at this point, she realizes all the shooting has stopped. It's now dead silent in the cabin. And so for a second, Ada was thinking to herself, maybe I managed to shoot both of them, and that's why it's quiet right now. But then another thought began to enter her head, that maybe she had only shot one of them, and the other survivor was moving into position to maybe ambush her. And so as she's running through what she's gonna do, she hears this horrible, loud thumping sound right above her in the second floor of the cabin. Now, Ada knew at this moment she should just get her dog and run. Because if this second shooter has survived and has now come into her cabin and is upstairs, that means the forest is now clear and she can make a run for it. But as she sat there by the island, still clutching her gun, in this beloved family cabin of hers, she began thinking about the fact that ever since that attack in Detroit over the summer, that had totally wrecked her life and made her scared of everything. And so as she heard the sound of whoever this was marching around in her second floor, she made a decision. She was going to stand her ground and fight. And so she took a deep breath, she stood up, and with gun in hand, she made her way to the stairs and began to go up. The police arrived at the cabin about 30 minutes later because Ada's friend did call the police, and she warned them that as far as she knew, there could be at least two gunmen there, and maybe Ada had shot one of them, she wasn't sure. And so when the police arrived, they showed up, guns drawn, and they walked up to the cabin and they searched the outside, but there was nobody out there, it was silent.
And then when they made entry into the cabin, they saw clearly there had been a shootout. I mean, there were bullet holes all over the place, broken windows. But after searching the cabin top to bottom, they didn't find anybody. No Ada, no shooters. However, they did find Ada's terrified dog inside of the cabin, and the dog would be just fine. Now, once the cabin was secured of any threats, the police would do another comprehensive search looking for any evidence that would kind of tell them, where Ada or these shooters had gone. And during this secondary search, they would find Ada's shoes and her cell phone on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find her gun on the ground not far from the roof, suggesting maybe she had fallen off the roof or jumped from the roof, but they were kind of located roughly in the same area. And during this secondary search, they wouldn't find Ada or the gunman, but they would find Ada's cell phone and her shoes on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find Ada's gun on the ground not far from where her shoes and cell phone had been found. But that was it. Police immediately launched a massive search in the forest surrounding the cabin, but despite looking all over the place, they could not find any signs of Ada or her attackers. Police checked local hospitals to see if maybe the man that Ada had shot had shown up seeking medical attention, but as far as they could tell, he hadn't. And so pretty quickly, the police theorized that maybe there were no gunmen. Maybe what really happened here is Ada's boyfriend attacked her, and he was responsible for whatever happened to her. But when police checked on Ada's boyfriend, it would turn out he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been with Ada's adult son at the time Ada had gone missing. And Ada's own son said, yes, for sure, he was with me. He did not do this. But after that, the police thought, okay, well, maybe if Ada's boyfriend didn't do this, maybe he hired other people to hurt Ada. But there was no evidence of any strange financial transactions, and as far as they could tell when they did some digging, there was no strife in Ada and her boyfriend's relationship. So there was no clear reason why he would want to hurt her. And so that lead also kind of fell flat. Police would confirm that Ada was attacked that previous summer by this random guy in Detroit, and so for a little while they speculated that, maybe this guy, this attacker, who had never been caught, had maybe tracked Ada down to finish off the job. But that seemed so far-fetched and just unlikely that basically was shut down as well. And as the days passed, the evidence that was coming in only made the case more confusing. For example, there were all these bullets fired during this big shootout in the cabin, and when they examined the actual bullets they extracted from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, they were all from Ada's gun. However, outside and inside the cabin, they found all these different shell casings, suggesting that those bullets had been fired from different weapons, i.e., maybe the attacker's weapons. And so as the weeks passed by and Ada and her attackers were not found, people began to speculate that, maybe this was all an elaborate setup by Ada just so she could disappear. Or other people thought maybe she was abducted by aliens. I mean, there were lots of theories surrounding this, but basically nobody knew what happened. And then pretty soon, the case just went completely cold. That is, until December 21st, 2019, so about 2 months after Ada's disappearance. And on that day, Ada's family decided to drain a pond that was near that cabin in the woods. At this point, the family was so desperate for closure that they were prepared to do just about anything to find Ada and to figure out what happened to her. And so even though this pond had previously been searched by the police, they drained this pond, and sure enough, they find Ada. She was deceased, and her body was found about 300 yards away from the cabin, and she was covered in only about a foot of water. Now, initially, the speculation was, well, here you go, she must have been chased out of her cabin by these attackers, and she was shot and killed, and this is where she fell. But after a quick examination of her body, it was clear she had no bullet wounds on her anywhere. In fact, she didn't even have any bruises on her or any major scrapes or cuts or anything, so it didn't even seem like she had been in any sort of physical struggle at all before she died. In fact, unless she had drowned, it really just seemed totally unclear how she had died. It was not until the medical examiner did Ada's autopsy that all this baffling evidence began to make sense. It would turn out, in the wake of that horrible random attack that Ada had suffered over the summer, that Ada was actually doing far worse than she let on to her family and friends. She had basically begun to cope with her trauma and anxiety with substance abuse. And so on the night that she had died, she was likely feeling totally stressed out and anxious, and she couldn't sleep as a result. And so she had taken some Valium, which is a fairly strong sedative, and also some anti-anxiety medication, but after taking those pills, she still wasn't tired. And so that was when she decided to, go out for a walk with her dog to clear her head and have a smoke. But it was not cigarettes that she was smoking. She was smoking methamphetamine, known simply as meth. And meth is a very strong stimulant that people like because it makes them feel very strong and confident and alert, which for Ada was a powerful antidote to the helplessness she was feeling all the time from the attack she had suffered that summer. But one of the many downsides of meth is that it can make you extremely paranoid. And so during her walk that night, as she's smoking meth, she sees a mountain lion, which terrifies her, and then after the mountain lion trots off, it was like that jolt of adrenaline and fear from seeing the mountain lion didn't subside because of smoking meth. It was like the meth sent her into this paranoia overdrive that she couldn't escape from. And so when Ada went back inside of her cabin, she very likely did see people in her windows. But almost certainly it was just her own reflection, but again, she's in this meth-induced paranoid state, and so instead of realizing it was her own reflection, she thought it was like intruders coming to get her. And before long, she'd raised her gun and thought the people outside were raising their gun back at her, but again, it's just her reflection. And so when she was shooting, she was basically having a shootout with herself. And then as for, the strange noises she was hearing, like the footsteps on the second floor, very likely those were just natural sounds kind of happening outside. She's out in the middle of a forest. There's lots of noises that are totally natural at night. But again, she's in this paranoid state, and so she went upstairs to confront the person and then didn't see anybody. And then police theorized that she must have, climbed out onto the roof to hide from these attackers. And then at some point, for reasons unknown, she leapt from the roof or climbed down or something, leaving behind her cell phone and shoes on the roof. She left her gun on the ground, and then she ran off into the forest, where she ultimately collapsed, 300 yards away in a foot of water, where she died not from drowning, but from a combination of hypothermia and also a toxic combination of drugs in her system. And so in the end, the danger that Ada was trying to escape was in her own mind.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Denver Spider-Man. On October 17, 1941, 73-year-old Philip Peters was supposed to join his friends for dinner, but he never showed up. His neighbors knew Phil was living alone at the time because his wife had recently fallen and broken her hip and was in the hospital, and so they were worried about Phil being on his own, and they thought, you know what, let's just be sure, let's call the police and have them go over and check on him. When the police arrived at his house, they knocked on the door, no answer. They tried the door handle, it was locked. They tried the other door, that was locked too. They looked in the windows, it was all dark, and they had to get another neighbor who had a key to open the door for them. When they stepped inside, there was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen is Phil Peters, face down. He has been bludgeoned to death. The police immediately draw their weapons and they're looking around the house thinking someone could still be here. And they clear the whole house and there's no one there. And so a whole bunch of detectives converge on the house and they start investigating. And they realize pretty quickly how strange the scene was. Nothing in the house was vandalized, nothing in the house was stolen, and Phil himself was just a very modest, retired auditor. He certainly didn't have any enemies, and so the revenge angle didn't necessarily make much sense. But then you gotta remember that when police first got there before they discovered his body, the house was shut and locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. And so whoever was in there with Phil at the time of his death must have known Phil enough to have a key of their own or have Phil open the door for them. So it made investigators wonder what would motivate some person that's in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous crime when the obvious angles such as theft, vandalism, revenge have basically been crossed off. Not to mention there was virtually no evidence of who could have done this, with the exception of the murder weapon, which was this big piece of metal called a stove shaker. But the person who had used it to kill him had taken the time to meticulously wipe it off. So there was nothing on it, no fingerprints, no anything. So for months, detectives agonized over this case, but they got nowhere. Nine months later, a housekeeper was hired by Phil's widow to help around the house now that Phil was gone. And she said as soon as she moved in, she started hearing strange tapping sounds all through the house, but didn't think anything of it. And so that day, the day she's calling police, she's alone in the Peters residence and she hears the tapping and it's coming from the kitchen. And she thinks, oh, it's got to be a woodpecker just outside the house, outside the window. And she said as she looked into the kitchen, on the other side of the kitchen was a door that opened up to a flight of stairs that went to the second floor. And she said it was slowly opening. And out from behind comes this white hand that reaches to the side of the door and begins to pull it open. And she screams, and the hand retracts back into the space. And then she hears it storm up the stairs and run around on the upstairs before going silent again. She ran out of the house and she ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police immediately go to the house and they go inside, guns drawn, and they're looking for this person because they're thinking perhaps the murderer is back. And they're looking all through the house and there's nothing. There's not even a sign of a break-in. And so the police go back to the housekeeper and to Miss Peters. They explain that we couldn't find anyone, but given the history of your house, we don't think it's safe for you to be in there. And so the housekeeper didn't go back and Miss Peters was moved back to the hospital where she could be looked after during the police investigation. At this point, the police decide we're going to permanently stake out this house. We're going to have 2 detectives that are outside this house watching it at all times. And so 2 detectives go and they're sitting outside and for a couple of days they're not seeing anything, they're not hearing anything, and they decide to just go inside and have a look around. They both walk into the house, they go upstairs, they look around, they don't see anything, they go back downstairs, and as they're standing on the first floor getting ready to leave, they hear what sounds like a doorknob turning upstairs. They both heard it, so they go upstairs and they start searching different rooms. And one of the detectives goes into the bedroom and opens up a closet, and past all the clothes, bottom left-hand corner, he sees a foot dart into a little space in the back corner of the closet. And without any hesitation, this guy jumps head first into the closet and grabs the foot of this mystery person who's crawling into a tiny little panel in the back of a closet. And he holds on to this person who's fighting with their life to get away, and he starts pulling them out, and he's yelling for his partner to come over. He comes charging in, they both grab this person, and they yank this person out, and they would describe him as the strangest looking person they had ever seen. He was super tall, but rail thin, and his skin was so dirty, it appeared gray. His name was Theodore Coneys, and he had been living in this house for a year. Before Coneys moved in, he had fallen on hard times, he was sleeping in alleyways, and as it started to get colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his longtime friend, Phil Peters, and he would ask him for some money and maybe an opportunity to crash at his house for a couple of days. But as it happened, when he got to Phil's house, Phil wasn't there. Phil was at the hospital visiting his wife who had a broken hip, and so the house was vacant. And Coneys saw an opportunity and he broke in. And at first, his plan was just to steal food, get warmed up a little bit, and then leave. But he noticed when he was looking through the house for things to take, that in the back of one of these closets was a panel that led to this tiny little, almost secret attic space that wasn't being used for anything because it was impossibly small. You'd have to be incredibly skinny just to get through the little square opening that would bring you into this little space. And then once you got in, you could only get in by slithering head first in. You couldn't stand up. You had to be laying the entire time. You couldn't extend your legs all the way if you're a full-grown adult. So you're kind of tucked up in almost like a pseudo-fetal position. But Coneys saw this as a huge upgrade from living on the streets, and he decided that this is where he's going to live for the winter. And so he went around the house gathering supplies between blankets and food and water, and he filled his tiny little space, and then he went back downstairs and he locked the front door again, made sure everything looked the way it was when he showed up, and he went into his little space and shut the door behind him. And when Phil came home that night, he didn't notice anything, and for the next several weeks, Phil never noticed a thing. Every time Phil would leave, Coneys would sneak out, go downstairs, make himself some coffee, get a bite to eat, then go back up to his little space. He even cut into the house's wiring system and stole one of Phil's radios, brought it into the cubby with him, attached it to the new wiring, and he got to listen to the news so he didn't feel so isolated from the outside world. But about a month later, Coneys leaves his little spot to go downstairs because he thinks Phil is gone. He gets to the kitchen, he's going to the fridge. When he shuts the fridge, he looks over and there's Phil standing there looking at him like, "What are you doing in my kitchen?" In a panic, Coneys grabs the stove shaker and beats Phil to death. Not knowing what else to do, he wipes off the murder weapon, leaves it where it is. He goes in the fridge, he gets some more food and drink, and he goes right back up to where he lives. He would follow the investigation of Phil Peters' death on his radio, curled up inside of Phil Peters' house.
Konies was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence read to him, he says out loud, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years."
The fire was gone, my heart of stone, my faith withdrawn. But in the dark, a shimmer stayed, a spark that whispered, "You're still made." Through every scar, the stars align. They trace the light that once was mine. From ashes I bloom in golden dust. The harbor mist clings to your hair. Cold air threads through the salt-soaked stair. You pull your white sweater tight to your chest. The world unravels, but you're at rest. Every breath is a ghost in the night. Every step flickers under dim light.
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane.